and found myself standing in the kitchen staring at my pool through the back window, waiting for some sign of absurdity to erupt like it had every other time Karen got involved. Sure enough, by mid-morning, it came, not with a splash this time, but with the unmistakable sound of foldable lawn chairs being dragged across pavement. I opened the blinds just enough to see two men I didn't recognize setting up a pop-up canopy near the sidewalk outside my property line. One held a clipboard. The other was wearing a t-shirt with the HOA logo printed across the chest, like it was a badge of honor. A car pulled up behind them, and out stepped Karen in heels, sunglasses, and what looked like a courtroom-ready pantsuit, tugging two sulking kids in tow and holding a thick folder of what I could only assume was a combination of her own made-up evidence and laminated versions of her personal grievances. It looked less like a casual HOA gathering and more like a backyard trial. And apparently I was the defendant. A few minutes later, Greg texted me a simple message. She turned the HOA vote into a public event. The nerve. The gall. The sheer audacity of using the neighborhood's landscaping budget to set up what was now visibly becoming a kind of informal tribunal complete with fold-out chairs for witnesses, and even a cooler full of juice boxes for the kids. I put on jeans and boots, poured myself a coffee, and walked out the front door like I was headed to my own sentencing. As I approached, I noticed a crowd had already gathered, some curious, some supportive, and a few clearly just there for the drama. Karen stood in the center like she was directing a community theater production of suburban injustice, holding her folder like it contained nuclear code. When she saw me, she smiled sweetly and said, "Well, look who finally decided to show up." I nodded, sipping my coffee, and asked if this was the part where she recited opening statements. She ignored that and gestured toward a folding table where 3 HOA board members sat, Denise among them, looking increasingly like she regretted every minute of this circus. Karen began, loudly, with a list of my alleged violations, which now included emotional harm, neighborhood hostility, and failure to comply with unspoken standards of neighborly behavior. Her kids sat next to her, visibly disinterested, one scrolling on a phone and the other kicking the table leg. She summoned a witness, a woman named Cheryl from 3 houses down, who offered a vague and nervous testimony about how Karen once mentioned using my pool for a playdate and that she had assumed it was a neighborhood thing. Cheryl kept looking over at me like she wanted to apologize without saying the words. Then came Luis, the pool cleaner, who clarified under questioning that the message he received was from a number he now knew wasn't mine, and that he had come assuming it was business as usual. Karen quickly pivoted, accusing Luis of bias because I tipped him too generously. That was met with a low, collective groan from the crowd. Even Denise sighed. When it was finally my turn, I stood calmly and opened a simple folder containing printed photos, legal definitions, highlighted bylaw excerpts, and a fresh affidavit from Greg stating he had witnessed Karen's children being lifted over my locked gate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The crowd leaned in as I detailed the events in order. The surprise pool takeover, the locked gate tantrum, the fake text to the pool cleaner, the flyer campaign advertising a pool party I never consented to, and finally the video footage of Karen placing those flyers herself, completely unaware she was being recorded from 2 different angles. Then I rested my case by reading aloud the HOA clause that stated clearly any member who misrepresented HOA property access or impersonated another resident in written form was subject to disciplinary action, including fines, suspension of voting rights, and formal review for removal from the board. Karen laughed, high-pitched and theatrical, and said I was being dramatic. She called my folder a scrapbook of paranoia. Then she turned to the crowd and asked who among them had never used a neighbor's amenities, in the spirit of community. No one raised their hand. Not one person. Even Cheryl looked down at her shoes. Karen seemed to falter for a moment, visibly surprised by the lack of support. Then Greg, bless him, raised his voice and asked if now was a good time to play the footage. I nodded. He walked up and placed his tablet on the table in front of the board members, who watched silently as Karen's actions played out in crystal-clear 1080p. The crowd shifted, murmured, someone even chuckled. Karen's face froze. Then she tried to claim the footage was selectively edited, even as it showed her climbing the fence to tape a flyer on my gate like a stealthy teenage prankster. Denise leaned forward, removed her reading glasses, and said, "Thank you, I think we've seen enough." Karen stammered something about procedural injustice and how this wasn't a fair trial, but no one was listening anymore. The board huddled for a few moments, then stood to announce their decision. Karen, they said, had clearly violated at least 3 bylaws, including unauthorized use of private property, impersonation of another member, and knowingly distributing false information under the guise of HOA messaging. Effective immediately, she would be suspended from board duties pending a formal vote at next month's meeting and fined for misuse of HOA resources. A smaller but equally satisfying clause included a temporary ban from initiating community events and from accessing private properties unless explicitly invited. Karen blinked like she'd just been told the earth was flat. As the crowd began to disperse, I turned to leave and heard Karen behind me say, loudly enough for everyone to hear, that this wasn't over. That the board would regret siding with someone who clearly didn't respect neighborhood unity. I didn't turn around. I just walked home, poured another lemonade, and sank into my porch chair with a quiet satisfaction that can only come from defeating nonsense using the tools of its own creation. The flamingo float drifted slowly across the water, undisturbed, and I found myself thinking that maybe, just maybe, peace was finally returning to Timberline Drive. But deep down I knew better. Karen wasn't the type to retreat and reflect. No, she was the type to plot. And something told me the next wave of chaos wouldn't come from a flyer or a fake pool party, but from something even pettier, and far more dangerous in the hands of someone who believed HOA bylaws were just polite suggestions. The following Tuesday began with the sound of police tires crunching gravel in front of my driveway and ended with me standing in my bathrobe on the front porch trying to explain to a county deputy why I was being accused of criminal intimidation involving a lawn chair, a garden hose, and psychological manipulation through beverage choice. Apparently, Karen had filed a formal police complaint, claiming that I had created an atmosphere of targeted harassment and intimidation after her children suffered what she described as emotional trauma from being excluded from my pool. Yes, emotional trauma. From being asked to leave water they weren't invited into on private land. According to her statement, I had used the visual of me sipping a lemonade while sitting calmly as her kids were trapped inside a locked gate as a way to assert psychological dominance. The deputy, Officer Rayburn, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, read this to me with a perfectly neutral face. I don't know how he kept it straight, but I had to bite my cheek not to laugh. When he finished, he asked if I had any comment. I told him I had about 17 comments, most of them printable, but that I'd start with a simple one. The footage. I invited him in and queued up the backyard camera from that day. He watched, arms crossed, as Karen lifted her own children over my fence and proceeded to lounge like Cleopatra beside my pool while I stood awkwardly with a lemonade, clearly baffled. The part where I locked the gate? It was shown clearly to be exterior, safe, and reversible from the inside. The kids were never trapped. They were just temporarily annoyed. Officer Rayburn nodded and asked if I would be comfortable forwarding the video to the department in case this escalated. I asked him if it hadn't already escalated. He cracked a small smile and said, "Not legally. Yet." Before he left, he warned me that while this particular incident didn't meet the threshold for criminal charges, Karen had also filed for a formal civil complaint claiming emotional damages. She was apparently alleging that my behavior caused undue stress, public humiliation, and loss of community standing. I stared at him, stunned, and asked if that was even a real legal term. He shrugged and said people file stranger things every week. I closed the door behind him and just stood there for a moment, staring at nothing. I wasn't even mad. I was impressed. I had underestimated Karen. I thought the HOA suspension and public embarrassment would be enough to make her retreat quietly into grudge-holding silence. But no, she had gone full scorched earth, taking the conflict from the ridiculous to the legally absurd. I made 2 calls. The first was to Denise, who picked up immediately and didn't even wait for me to speak before launching into a tired monologue about how she'd just been informed that Karen was petitioning to have her board suspension overturned. Denise sounded exhausted, like she'd been fighting this battle for years in different shapes and colors. She told me that Karen had requested a special HOA appeal hearing and was using the police report she filed as supporting evidence of board bias and neighborhood targeting. I asked Denise if she'd ever considered banning Karen from all meetings. She laughed, said she'd considered it weekly for 3 years, and then hung up to get started drafting her own statement for the appeal. The second call was to my cousin, Paul, a defense attorney with a particular taste for bizarre civil cases and a dark sense of humor that had kept our family holiday dinners interesting for over a decade. When I explained what happened, Paul didn't say anything for a solid 10 seconds. Then he simply asked, and I quote, "Are you being punked, or did this woman actually cite beverage-based intimidation?" I read him the complaint. He asked me to forward it immediately and told me he'd be at my place in an hour. True to his word, Paul showed up in jeans, a blazer, and holding a coffee like he was ready to cross-examine my landscaping. He reviewed all the documents, watched the footage twice, and then told me with a grin that not only did I have nothing to worry about, but if Karen pushed this any further, I could probably countersue for defamation and abuse of process. He also suggested that, should it come to court, I offer Karen a peace settlement consisting of a gift card to a public pool and a lifetime ban from flavored seltzers. I appreciated the levity, but it didn't change the fact that I now had an open civil complaint in my name. That night, I did what any rational person does when they're being legally harassed over a backyard pool incident. I made a second pitcher of lemonade, set up a new lock on the back fence, and ordered 2 motion-activated sprinklers from a hardware store website, the kind designed to scare off raccoons but that worked equally well on people with poor boundaries. The next morning, my neighbor Greg caught me outside installing one of the sprinklers and immediately assumed I was preparing for another invasion. He wasn't wrong. I explained what happened, and he offered to testify at any hearing, trial, or episode of Judge Judy that might arise. Then he said something that stuck with me. He said, "You know, she's not really fighting you. She's fighting the fact that someone told her no." I nodded, because I knew it was true. For people like Karen, the battle isn't about property lines or bylaws, or even children swimming in a pool. It's about authority, control, the fantasy that they decide what the world looks like, and anyone who doesn't comply is a threat that needs to be subdued or erased. It wasn't personal. It was pathological. 2 days later, Paul helped me file a formal response to the civil complaint, including a request for dismissal on the grounds of lack of merit and an attached binder of evidence. Then, because Paul was Paul, he added a motion for the court to consider punitive damages if Karen's claims were found to be intentionally misleading. He said it was a long shot, but sometimes just putting the words punitive damages into a document was enough to make people think twice. Karen, however, was not most people, because that same afternoon, as I sat on the porch watching the sprinklers twitch in readiness, a familiar minivan pulled up and out came Karen's kids again. This time without her. They approached the gate, tried the lock, and then stood there debating whether it was worth climbing. I stood up, walked over, and told them kindly but firmly that the pool was no longer available. One of them said, "But Mom said it's fine." I told them it wasn't, and that their mom had apparently forgotten to mention the police visit, the lawsuit, and the new motion-activated sprinklers. I told them to take 3 steps back unless they wanted a surprise. As if on cue, one sprinkler activated and gave the nearest kid a gentle spray across his sneakers. They shrieked, ran off laughing and screaming, and within 5 minutes, Karen was texting me furious accusations of targeting minors. I didn't reply. I just forwarded the footage to Paul and Denise,